Hey there, sophomores. So I am using my iPhone here, and the camera's in a weird position, so it's going to look like I'm like looking off at the distance every so often instead of at you. So I apologize for that ahead of time. So we have gone over cell theory, or at least you have covered cell theory in this previous week.
And there was also a quick video for you to do on the plasma membrane. And I gave you guys some puzzles to do, and I think one of them was an Amoeba Sister video, and I can't remember what the other one was off the top of my head, to be honest. But anyways, point being, I haven't given you anything specifically from me on that subject, so I wanted to go ahead and kind of quickly cover
some of the ideas that cell theory encompasses, and then just quickly go through the plasma membrane, because that can be a little intimidating, and I think some of you got a little intimidated watching that video that I assigned last week. So I just kind of want to clear out any of the confusion and just kind of point out what I think is important for you to know here. So anyways, let's go on ahead and get into it.
So what is a whirlpool? Well, a whirlpool is something known as a dissipative structure. And a dissipative structure is something that it's something that you can point to. It has characteristics. It has a symmetry. It has a shape. So like a whirlpool, or like a storm, or like a hurricane, when you see a hurricane coming, it's this big spiraling thing. It has an eye at the center. All of the stormy stuff is going on in the donut part of it. And, you know, it's characterized by high winds and lightning and tornadoes and sheer rain and hail and everything like that, right? So it has patterns of behavior. It moves in a particular way. It moves in a predictable way, right? We're able to predict the paths of these hurricanes within certain amounts of error. So we can even predict where they're going to go and how they're going to behave. So the point is that all a hurricane is dust and water molecules that, have energy in them. And the hurricane is a structure that exists because it has a steady supply of energy. And if you guys pay attention to what happens to hurricanes as they, say, go over land, when they suddenly lose their energy and they lose their source of molecules, that water vapor, well, they start to fall apart and then they disappear. So the same thing is true for whirlpools. As soon as you interrupt the energy in a whirlpool, the whirlpool falls apart and those water molecules stop acting in an organized way. And they dissipate and they just become water molecules again, as opposed to a whirlpool. The reason I bring this up is because it's been hypothesized that you are a dissipative structure. And you're not a dissipative structure of water molecules and dust molecules like, say, a storm is or a hurricane is. But you're a dissipative structure of cells. You're made up of these tiny repeating units of cells. And you have 37.2 trillion cells, human cells, in your body. And that's a insane number. That's hard to wrap your mind around how much or how big that number is. 37.2 trillion. Now that's an average. That's for an average human. So if you're a 300-pound man versus a 150-pound man, well, you can assume you have more than double the amount. So these are very, 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 very tiny repeating units. And so long as they have a steady supply of energy, so that they can continue their functions, you continue to exist as a creature, as a living entity, as a dissipative structure. And it's interesting to think about what the cell is, because cells are, again, they're impossibly tiny. You can fit 10,000 of them on the head of a pin. So these are impossibly tiny little structures. And each one is capable of producing up to 10,000 different proteins. And the proteins are like the messengers and the workhorses. It's what the cell uses to do most of everything. Attack incoming viruses like the coronavirus. In fact, what we're doing right now with the vaccines is inserting genetic information into the cell, which is just instructions. We're using mRNA. Don't worry, it doesn't become part of your DNA. Don't freak out, folks. But we take a little piece of RNA, which is just genetic information, and we put it into your cells. And then the cell looks at that and goes, hey, I need to make this protein as per the instructions on this RNA. And it makes a protein, and that protein goes out, and it attacks the spiky structures on COVID, and then COVID can't get into your cells and infect them. So your little tiny cells, 10,000 of them on the head of a pen, each one of those tiny little things can make 10,000 different protein structures to send messages from cell to cell, or to organelle to organelle, to fend off invaders, to create different enzymes to help chemical reactions occur more easily in the body. It's an amazing tiny little thing. And if you were to take the DNA, your instructions that are all located inside the cell, the DNA that tells the cell what to do and how to make all of this stuff and when to make it and how to send it off and all of that, well, you could stretch it out in a single strand that would be 3 meters long. 3 meters long of information that you can squeeze all the way down into something that 10,000 of can fit on the head of a pen. So the cell is an amazingly complex structure, and it's also impossibly small, and you are made up of those things, those constant repeating units. And so long as you, again, can continue to supply it with the matter and energy that it needs, will continue to do all of the things that it does, and you will remain a structure. Once that energy is interrupted, once that flow of matter is interrupted, you cease to be. And all of those tiny little cells, which are made up of all sorts of different chemicals, and we went into some of them in macromolecules, right? All of that stuff begins to break down. The trillions and trillions of bacterial cells in your gut start to consume your organs. So the things that were helping you digest your food start digesting you once you can no longer keep them at bay. You decompose back into the sometimes single atoms, but generally these smaller molecules that you consumed to make you. Again, you are what you eat. So keeping your cells alive is obviously how you stay alive. And with cell theory, when we look into cell theory, all cells come from other cells. You came from a single cell. You came from a sperm cell and an egg cell joining. And then that broke up into the trillions of cells that you are now. It continued to divide over and over and over and over again. But all cells are a lineage of other cells, because that sperm cell, it came from your dad, and the egg cell, it came from your mom. And all of them, well, they all started off as a single fertilized sperm and egg cell, and that came from their parents, and so on and so forth, back and back and back and back as far as you can go. So the point is, all of your cells are essentially copies of other cells. They have been continuously replicated through time until we eventually, get something that looks like you. So the first part of cell theory is fairly powerful. Now, all living things are made of cells. That's what separates you from the other dissipative structures. You're not a hurricane and you're not a whirlpool. You're something a heck of a lot more complex. Storms can't go out and seek out the energy and matter they need. They are just kind of automatic processes that follow whatever the conditions are. You actively can go out and you can gather the material and the energy and things that you need. But everything that's living, everything that can do what I just described, actively find energy and matter to continue existing, well, if you can do that, you're living. You're a living thing. And all living things are made up of cells. And all of those cells have either RNA or DNA and proteins and lipids and the macromolecules that we discussed or learned about a few weeks ago. Cells are also the most basic unit of life, and that perform life functions. And what that means is that on its own, a single cell can exist. We have single cell organisms out there everywhere. But if you take the nucleus of a cell and stick it out in the environment, it has no way of gathering the resources it needs to survive. If you take a mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell, it makes ATP. Well, if you put that out in the environment, it won't continually reproduce and make more mitochondria. It will die. So the cell is the smallest unit of life that can perform actual functions, do things, replicate, make all those protein structures I talked about. So again, all cells come from other cells. So let's recap. Cell theory states, it's three simple tenets. Cell theory states that all cells come from other cells. And as I said, even you come from a single cell that's been fertilized and then divided into trillions and trillions of other cells. And at some point in time, you will be completely replaced. Every single one of your cells will be completely replaced in your lifetime. Sometimes hundreds of times, sometimes thousands of times, sometimes just a dozen times. So your skin cells, you're constantly shedding dead skin cells. You're constantly shedding dead hair. You're constantly repairing damaged liver cells. And, everything in your body is essentially a cell. It's a little unit. And when it dies or when it starts to go bad, it's replaced. And we get rid of those dead old cells. So eventually, every single part of you that has ever been you will have been replaced at some point in time. Think of it this way. You have a boat. You've had a boat for 50 years. And over the course of that 50 years, you've replaced absolutely every single piece of the boat. You've replaced the oars, you've replaced the motor, you've replaced the hull of the ship, you've replaced all the support beams. Not all at once, but piece by piece until not a single piece on that boat is the same as what you purchased originally. Is it still the same boat? Well, that's an interesting question for you to ponder. But the same is true for you. You are that boat. Over time, everything in your body gets completely replaced, just a little bit at a time, not at all at once. So this ties into this all cells comes from other cells because, you started off as a single cell and replicated over and over trillions of times to make you. And this is just how it works. Sorry for the ramble. It's Sunday, okay? All right. Other things to mention, again, all living things are made of cells, and the cells are the most basic single unit of life that can perform all the functions necessary to continue life. All right, so let's go into the plasma membrane here. I will go as fast as I can. So, fast as I can. I will try and do as good of a job of explaining this without being too long. All right, so. The plasma membrane is what encompasses the cell. It surrounds the cell. And you always see this picture, which is a cross section here. Okay, and the cross section can be confusing because, it seems like it's a single flat layer. But you need to imagine that this thing is an orb, or if it's a plant cell, oftentimes a giant cube, or rectangular cube. So this plasma membrane wraps around the entire cell three-dimensionally. So it's not just like a single flat sheet. And you have the outside of the cell out here and the inside here. So this would wrap around all the way three-dimensionally, and you have the inside of the cell there. Okay? All right, I'm going to take that stuff off there for a second. The plasma membrane is made up of proteins, which are these little blue things here, and this right here, and that right there, and all the stuff that you see. It's made up of the plasma membrane itself, the phospholipid bilayer, the little phospholipids. And with the phospholipids, you have the little heads here, and I'll use a different color so you can actually see what I'm doing. You have these little heads. And these things like water. They're hydrophilic. hydro means water and philic means fondness of. So these things like water. And the tails here, these guys, well, these are hydrophobic. They don't like water at all. And what does the cell need? What does all life need? Well, it needs water. So water is in the environment that you're in. And you don't necessarily want to allow all of the water in at once. You want to be able to keep it out. So these hydrophilic tails actually actively keep water from just freely transporting through your cells anytime they want. Other things to mention. So you have these proteins here. And these proteins, all these little blue things that are sticking around, these things will allow different types of molecules in and out of the cell, depending on what they are. Some of them are meant to bind with certain molecules, and others are shaped in a particular fashion to simply allow the transport of a certain amount of water at any point in time. So like this one down here, this guy, this protein channel, it kind of allows a steady transport of protein, it steadily allows a transport of things like water and other things that are necessary for the cell. But then you have others which are more selective in what they allow through. They actually have to come out and grab and bind to something and then pull it through. So when you look at the plasma membrane, one way to kind of think of it is kind of like an exterior wall. Each one of those little proteins is kind of like a door or a window in a house. And you'll notice there's different size windows in this house. There's different size doors. There's the front door, which allows people in, dogs and things that are about the size of people or smaller. You can kind of maybe get a couch or a chair in through there. But then you also have the garage door, which allows very large things in. You can move trucks and boats inside of garages, right? You have some windows that only allow light in. You can't open them up. So they only allow just one particular type of molecule, and it's very, very select. It won't let air in, it won't let moisture in, it just allows light, visible light through. But then you have, again, others like this one where, you might be able to crawl through that yourself if you contort yourself to the right shape. Or you can throw your baby brother out the window because he's much smaller, right? And then you even have little tiny bathroom windows, which, you won't be able to really fit anything out through, maybe just barely your arm. And then you have the structures, little vents, air vents that allow air circulation in your attic and things like that. And they're not letting anything in because they generally have screens on them. So the only thing coming in and out of there would be air. So the same thing is true when you kind of look at the plasma membrane. All of these different glycoproteins and glycolipids and integral proteins, which are ones that go from one end to the other completely, or channel proteins, so on and so forth. All of these are designed to only allow certain shapes, sizes, or even very select particular molecules in and out of it. So this can get really complex, and you can really get into the chemistry of why these work, but we're not going to go there. It's what we're really focused on is just understanding that this stuff exists and what their function is. But we're not going to get into the actual chemistry or the minutia behind that. That's for, advanced biology if you want to take it, or college if you're interested in this stuff. You'll go sell crazy in college. So what these little molecules, what these little proteins are doing in the plasma membrane, as you can see, are allowing things in and out of it. Now, we call the plasma membrane the fluid mosaic model because it's not necessarily a rigid structure. And the phospholipids can kind of move around, and so too can the proteins, depending on the type of protein. So it's better to kind of see it as this pliable, kind of floppy structure, kind of like a water balloon almost, where you can kind of squeeze a water balloon. Think of a water balloon underwater. And that's kind of a good way to think about it. But things, molecules, rubber molecules on the balloon can actually move around. Whereas a rubber balloon, the molecules stay in the same place. You can bend them and stretch them, but on an actual plasma membrane, those rubber molecules could move around and interchange differently without ever losing any water. So the plasma membrane is even more complex and awesome than that. So the different ways that things are transported through this, you have, again, those channel proteins, and this is a good example of what it looks like when you have water transporting. There's larger molecules out here, but notice they're too big to actually fit through that channel. Water is one of the smallest molecules there are. So with channel proteins, if they're fairly narrow, they can make it so only things that size go through. You have situations where the cell wants to get rid of waste. So what it will do is it will generate a globule, which is this thing right here. And you notice that is a plasma membrane. So it creates a plasma membrane around waste molecules or things that it wants to get rid of. And then when that plasma membrane comes and meets up with the plasma membrane on the outside of the cell, well, they fuse. And if you look, those polar heads stick to each other, and the polar tails are also attracted to each other, which is why it's a bilayer and why they arrange themselves like that and why this works so well. All the different heads, just like magnets, want to connect to each other in the correct way. So this is one way of, or another way of transporting things through the plasma membrane. You also have things like the sodium-potassium pump, which is one of those proteins that are on the outside of the membrane, and it only allows, well, sodium. And once a phosphorus molecule, I'm giggling at the animation, attaches to the end, it opens up and lets the sodium out and allows potassium in. And then the phosphorus molecule goes away. That's the signal to open back up and allow the potassium into the cell. So you can see that there's certain chemicals or certain elements that these proteins can actually select for as well.
So that's really kind of it. That's all I really wanted to discuss and review with you really quick.
It's easy to get intimidated by the cell. It's easy to get intimidated when we start talking about some of the finer functions of it. I wasn't a huge fan of cellular biology until really I started teaching it and understanding it and realizing how amazingly complex it is, and for something just so tiny.
Again, we're not going to be focusing too much on the minutiae, especially this year. We're really just going to be getting an overview. So it's easy to look at all these big words and freak out, but just remember, we're focusing on the larger concept here. I'm not necessarily going to be focused on you remembering the sodium-potassium pump and having to repeat out, what happens when the phosphorus molecule attaches to the protein sodium-potassium pump, blah, 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 blah. We're not going into that detail, so just relax, okay? All right.
Hopefully this was a helpful review for you, and I just want you guys to have a wonderful Thanksgiving. And so long as you completed the questions on this video, this was extra credit. So I will see you guys in a week. Have a great break.
JTBS.